Hello, and welcome to the Yale University Art Gallery. Thank you for joining us here and at home. My name is Marlene Theodore, and I am the Jane and Gerald Katcher Curator of Programs. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you and to introduce my friend and mentor and collaborator, John Walsh. It is true that John needs no introduction, not with this crowd. You all know John Walsh, you all love John Walsh. You keep coming back, and lucky for us, John keeps delivering. This series has received high praise so far. To quote one participant on Zoom, "I want to hear anything John Walsh has to say about art." John has been asking for a show of hands in these lectures. How many of you have been at a John Walsh lecture before? How many of you were at his first lecture series in the fall of 2013, Let This Be a Lesson, focused on the tradition of history painting? If you weren't, I'd recommend looking for it on YouTube. And even if you were, you can go back and watch it again. This first series, the brainchild of John and Pam Franks, was an early example of a kind of open university course. In total, and so far, John has offered 9 lecture series that include 55 lectures. These talks have been enjoyed by all of you in this lecture hall, and video recordings of all of the lectures can be found on the gallery's YouTube channel. John's Art Gallery lectures on YouTube have received almost 800,000 views and counting. Right? That is a lot. John has taught us a lot about how to look at art and how to talk about what we're seeing. But his influence does not stop there. His commitment to close looking and his model of patient engagement with art, thoughtful questions, comfort with silence, good humor, and beautifully crafted prose have influenced generations of Yale students. Each year, John generously accepts our invitation to meet with Yale undergrads, the Yale undergrads we train to give tours of the museum. This past fall, we spent an hour with John in front of a Mondrian painting. Loved the session, was one student review. When students reflect on all the trainings we have over the course of a year, the session with John consistently rises to the top. Quote, "John Walsh, just amazing," wrote a student. John supports the work of this museum in ways big and small, and for that I am enormously grateful. Thanks are also due to the series sponsorship, the Martin A. Ryerson Lectureship Fund, and the John Walsh Lecture and Education Fund. And now, for the culmination of what John's daughter, Anne Walsh, has dubbed the Mondrianathon, please, I can't take credit for that. Please join me in welcoming John Walsh to the podium for looking at Mondrian's meanings.
That was my producer. Everybody should have someone like that. Few will. Thank you, Marlene. Today, we take a last glance at Mondrian's remarkable early career as a realist painter up through his evolution to abstraction, evolved partly through an evolution of his own spirit. And we look a little bit at 20 years of mature work as the painter we know. We're going to have a look also around at his generation of European abstract artists and their mostly idealistic motives. I think Mondrian must be the most easily recognized modern painter. So much that in Star Trek, The Next Generation, as you'll remember, set 2 centuries in the future, when an officer on the Starship Enterprise called Commander Data, so-called because he's an android, a product of artificial intelligence and bioengineering, Data is explaining to an android pupil that this thing on the wall is what humans call a painting. The audience, of course, doesn't need to know who that artist is, but okay, who painted this? Or this. Yeah, it's less evident. You'd have to be a specialist in Dutch art or be Dutch or both to recognize the work of the young Piet Mondrian. One of the surprises about Mondrian was that he'd already had a respectable career before he was 30. He mastered one style after another after being a student at the Academy at Amsterdam in the 1890s, and he'd won a prize or two. He concentrated on landscape. He was attracted to it and could see a possible way to make a living at it. His family was educated and genteel, but poorish, and could not support him. At home, near where he lived, there were workaday subjects that he could paint in an amazing variety of styles, first meticulously observing them on the spot with drawings, like this one, and then painting in a very restrained pastel in the studio. He mastered oil sketching in monotone, working on an overcast day here with smoke and steam in the air, using few strokes, as few as possible, to get the masses and the overall tones right. And in the countryside around Amsterdam, he skipped conventional rural subjects like cattle and sheep, and often chose odd bits like this house and wash line and dancing white laundry. He was good at half light, too, getting the leaves and the pollard branches and the shimmering water with confident brushstrokes. He's almost an impressionist when he wants to be. At the right side, he stabs at the surface with broken strokes of green, and he gives the elderly branches a kind of cranky energy. At the left, a snow scene with another apple tree and a mass of vines with level pruned top, the dead leaves left to winter over. He made watercolors, sometimes out in the fields on his bike, as you see, taking in the pale green of late winter or spring, and the feeling of endless fields, the distant horizon, and water everywhere, in the clouds and in the backwaters. For Mondrian's generation, 17th century Dutch printmakers and painters of rural scenery and life on the land were well known, and they were getting more so as new museums opened in the Netherlands in the 1880s and 90s, inspired by growing nationalist pride in Dutch history. Illustrated books on artists were coming out in editions that artists could afford. Young painters of flat vistas and towering skies and their buyers were reminded of how beautiful their country had always been, in its distinctive way, that is, and how human ingenuity and hard labor had made it stay dry and prosperous. For several centuries, people who admired landscape paintings were brought up with the belief, reinforced by preachers, that to study nature was to study God, who revealed himself in his own creation. It was a cliche in Britain and the Netherlands that nature was another sacred book, like the Bible, a book of revealed truth. Mondrian wasn't a practicing Calvinist, despite his upbringing in a religious household, but he was an observer of the landscape as well as a museum goer, and he developed a kind of secular veneration of nature and of the particular structure of the land, flat, and of trees, vertical, with branches and patterns, out of which he distilled what he believed to be its essential nature. Collectors liked watercolor, which were cheaper than oil paintings, and Mondrian supplied them with popular subjects: peaceful farmyards along the river, laundry hanging out again, meticulously detailed, single flowers, which were a Mondrian specialty that he painted when he needed cash, which was chronically all the way into the 1920s when he was an abstract painter in Paris. still life in watercolor too, for money and probably to keep working on cold or rainy days. He painted commissioned portraits too, not often if he could help it, and the odd self-portrait like this one. They're mostly frontal and earnest. But outdoors was where Mondrian's heart was, you feel. Mills everywhere. But their historic work of milling grain and grinding seed oil was mostly being taken over by machines. Mondrian didn't treat them as heroic, the way Jacob van Ruysdael had, but the main feature of the otherwise flat land, pumping drainage up to the canals and creating ponds. Mondrian painted this mill from many angles and using different techniques, highly detailed in the picture at the left, where the moon is trying to hide behind a wispy cloud, and wonderfully fluid in the right, in the smaller painting here. Close up, also, in the case of this sketch, top cropped off by the artist. Lots of attention to the lilies and the reflections in the water. It's a kind of game. The reflection in the water looks as vivid and substantial as the real thing. And good high-key light, really almost impressionist light. And look in that detail on the right, what he does with the brush. He makes clouds with white paint with just a few turns of the wrist, and then it got dry, and he drew the black paint over the clouds to form the empty vein. Here, the mill sits idle, out of service. The sail frames under repair, it seems, showing its backside of barn and crumbling lumber. Here the mill is part of a classic Dutch composition, you might say to sell, but exaggerated in the breadth of the view and the sense of something more significant going on than just the daily disappearance of the sun. More like an apparition, a kind of timeless presence of goodness and order in the land. He painted this just a year before he decided to try something different. A mill in the sun and shattering colors. An experiment with the colors, in fact, that his younger French contemporaries Matisse and Flamenc were using, and the beginnings of the red, blue, yellow Mondrian that we know. He used studies that he'd made along the rivers to generate large paintings meant for exhibitions. That clump of trees at the left became the central motif of the wider painting at the right. He made the clumps of trees bigger. He doubled the trees with their reflection in the water. And the colors in the water are really striking in a way that's nothing like the brash mill you just saw. Here it's with layers of blue and yellow above, and the water below, the whole thing extended and intensified with these curling touches of thick paint. Trees. Mondrian finds a lot of different ways to see and to use trees. At the left, it's a screen of tiny leaves between the painter and the farm beyond, a bit dreamlike. Next to it, the majestic form we just saw. Further over, trees that in summer would be a canopy over the farm below them, providing shade, but now are nearly bare, with branches and trunks that wriggle and dance against the sky. And at the far right, a startling free sketch of trees with orangey yellow leaves under a bright blue sky. After seeing high-key paintings by the Fauve group in Paris and some younger artists, Mondrian applied the lessons, not just in that shrieking red and yellow windmill you saw, but to a favorite motif, the gnarly apple tree that picks up the last rays of the sun. and the darkening sky behind it is churning. When he goes to a show in Amsterdam in 1911 and he sees the pictures that Braque and Picasso have been painting in pale greens and grays and tans, and giving both solid forms and empty spaces equal force, he's soon off to Paris. We've looked in earlier lectures about the consequences of that move, the conversion to his own distinctive kind of cubism. So far, I've only given a sketch of what Mondrian believed about his art. I'm going to look now at what his idealist contemporaries were doing during a revolutionary period for European art. I'm just going to spend a few minutes looking around at other important artists and what they hope to accomplish. You've heard me say that Mondrian believed that art, his art, could help eventually to save the world from materialism and belligerence. And he wasn't alone in believing that. Since the turn of the 20th century, many artists and intellectuals had premonitions of horrors coming, destruction and death on a vast scale. Lots of utopian schemes were afoot. Some called for anarchism and violent revolution. Other visions for society were more peaceable, some nostalgic for the simplicities of the past, sort of wishful. Others were religious sects. There was internationalism, mysticism, all competing or overlapping. Mondrian's own beliefs were shaped by theosophy, which taught that the world could improve, one person at a time, if individuals' consciousness could be raised and strengthened. Mondrian knew how that might happen. He and other artists would turn away from merely picturing appearances. Instead, they would make art that would embody central, universal truths, expressed by color and line alone. And this would offer help to an audience, that's us, to see and think differently. And we could evolve thereby to a higher awareness, so society would too. And in time, we'd create a populace that would be less selfish, less rivalrous, less factionalized, more tolerant, and more compassionate. And in time, probably in centuries, we'd evolve to a higher state of being. Mondrian gave this kind of abstract art a name, neoplasticism, unfortunately, and wrote about it fervently. He helped launch a movement and a publication devoted to those ideals called De Stijl, and he made paintings to demonstrate it for 25 years until his death. I want to look now at some contemporary artists who held beliefs similar to Mondrian's. One of those was Wassily Kandinsky. In 1911, this book came out, On the Spiritual in Art, a treatise like Mondrian's. Kandinsky was born 6 years before Mondrian in Odessa, in Ukraine, and was a 30-year-old lawyer in Moscow when he decided to quit and become an artist. He was drawn not to Paris, but to Munich, where there were teachers and a progressive art world and a market for his work. At first, work in printmaking and then paintings. He used woodcut, a contemporary but consciously archaic technique for the prints, and for the paintings, a brilliant, colorful kind of neo-primitive style for fantasies of Russian medieval life and folk culture. He spent summers in the Bavarian Alps with his partner, the painter Gabriele Munter, and around that time he had a couple of experiences that in his retelling became classic origin stories of abstract art. And I'm going to read them to you because I love to read them. In Munich, I came home with my painting after making a study, still dreaming and wrapped up in the work I had completed, when suddenly I saw an indescribably beautiful picture drenched with an inner glowing. I rushed toward this mysterious picture, of which I saw nothing but forms and colors, and whose content was incomprehensible. Immediately, I found the key to the puzzle. It was a picture I had painted, leaning against the wall, standing on its side. The next day, I tried to get the same effect by daylight, but was only half successful. Even on its side, I always recognized the objects. Now I knew for certain that the object harmed the paintings. Here's the other story. When he recalls seeing a Monet painting for the first time. Previously, I had only known realistic art. And suddenly, for the first time, I saw a painting. The catalog informed me that it was a haystack. I could not recognize it, and that non-recognition was painful to me. I dully felt that the object of the picture was missing. And I looked with astonishment and confusion and noticed that not only draws you, but impresses itself indelibly on your memory and, completely unexpectedly, floats before your eyes, even to the last detail. What was entirely clear to me was the unexpected power of the palette, the colors, which surpassed all my dreams. Painting acquired a fairy tale power and splendor. And unconsciously, the object was discredited. The object was discredited as an indispensable element of a painting. But Mondrian would come to this conclusion himself, and just a few laters, but not by an epiphany like Kandinsky. Instead, Mondrian evolved through a long meditation on the essential forms of what he saw. The ceaseless motion of the waves, the structure of the trees, the light and color of nature. Those things led Mondrian to isolate them and concentrate them. Kandinsky could imagine a world of shapes endlessly expanding, floating, forming, reforming. Mondrian's poetry, there at the left, was of relationships between contrasting forms. He had had the experience of working his way through Cézanne at the top, and below it, Cubism, and Kandinsky didn't. Kandinsky was exploring a kind of visual free association on a very big scale. Mondrian was absorbing how the Cubist techniques could flatten space, could liberate objects from gravity, and could even give the forms a life of their own. Both of them were devoted to using art for elevating humanity and helping individuals to see. For Kandinsky, the heart of the matter is what he called inner necessity. The need, that is, for the artist to understand the power of color and form and use them empathetically to stir the spirit of the viewer. So, similar purposes, different forms. For Mondrian, the essential forms were in opposition to one another. Lines were vertical and horizontal, shapes they made were rectangular, and the colors were primary. And everything was in the relationships between them and among them. That's what he said. And which, by the artist's intuition, could result in balance. For Kandinsky, lines and shapes were fluid, floating, and the relationships enigmatic, suggestive. In fact, the title he gave this painting at the right is Yellow, Red, Blue, the primaries. But they're having a kind of airborne ballet, while Mondrian's primary colors are sitting still at a polite distance. Kandinsky's shapes are circular and spiral and undulating, Mondrian, on the other hand, had banished circles and even curves from his visual utopia, where they would have been disruptive. Well, curves and circles had a lot more appeal than straight lines for most abstract artists across Europe. Sure, because of their associations with the natural world, with the human body, even with planetary orbits and the cosmic, the infinite. Curves could express movement, as they do in the Franz Kupka painting on the left, or growth in nature in the work of Jacob Bendien, a Dutch artist connected to the de Stijl group. And two paintings over, Robert Delaunay, a mystic, and finally at the right, Kandinsky himself, who wrote this: "The circle is the synthesis of the greatest oppositions. It combines the concentric and the eccentric in a single form and equilibrium." Now, I skipped the painting in the middle. It's a work by another believer in the expressive energy of circles and curves. These are works by Hilma af Klint, whose life and career track parallel Mondrian's, but who was hardly heard of outside Sweden until 1986, when she was included with Mondrian in the great LA exhibition, The Spiritual in Art. She was recognized not just as spiritual, but having a claim to be the first abstract artist. Like Kandinsky, she was middle-aged when she decided to go to the Royal Academy, and like Mondrian, she was a very good conventional landscape painter. Like both of them, she had learned from the teachings of theosophy, but she was an active participant. But like them, she wanted to make art that embodied the deepest truths about life and growth and the structure of the world, and for that, only lines and shapes would do, mostly circular and spiral. In her will, she sequestered and bequeathed, she kept secret, actually, 1,200 abstract works, none of them seen except by a few, and couldn't be seen for 20 years after her death. In Russia, after World War I, a group of a dozen odd artists, led by Kazimir Malevich, was inspired by Cubism and its radical remaking of imagery by deconstruction and reconstruction. The left, we see the wonderful painting by Malevich at Yale, the knife grinder in multiple exposures, a kind of Duchamp idea with léger flavor. The name for the new movement, suprematism, actually meant nothing political. It was going to stress what Malevich called the primacy of pure feeling in art. In other words, nothing material and nothing useful. There was a lot of playful wit and mockery, though, which you see in Malevich's installation of 1919 with the infamous painting of a black square hanging at the top corner, which was a place in Russian tradition, a place in the room that had been reserved for religious icons. The two at the bottom here have a spoofy sort of relation to picture titles and to abstraction itself. At the right, airplane flying could suggest flying up art. The black and red one, entitled Painterly Realism of a Boy with a Knapsack, Color Masses in the Fourth Dimension, is kind of wonderfully officious and silly. Suprematism did not last long in that particular fraught political situation in Russia, and was soon succeeded by constructivism, the movement led by L. Lissitzky, that was deadly serious about putting art and design to work for the new proletarian revolutionary state. Now, in this glance I'm giving you in all directions about Mondrian, I need to say something about Italians and futurism. I put this turbulent Kandinsky on the right because it's one of the visions he had of the future, the ultimate truth, in fact, the end destruction as described in the Apocalypse. Next to it is Boccioni's apocalyptic looking, but actually forward-looking vision of a humankind advancing, building a city that's rising there in the background, full of laborers laboring, and huge horses racing through the streets, terrified. The Italian futurists were not only visual artists, but also writers and musicians, and their founder was a poet, Tommaso Marinetti, who wrote, "We want no part of the past." What they wanted was rapid progress, not peaceable evolution, and basta to venerable conservative Italian culture and tradition, in fact, to everything that held back progress in the new 20th century. The machines, the crowds, the speed, the electric light, the fast cars, the daring, even the violent. Futurists were big on manifestos. Marinetti's was published in 1909. It puts Mondrian's hope for peaceable evolution into perspective. He wrote, "We want to glorify war, the only cure for the world. Militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of the anarchists, the beautiful ideas which kill, and contempt for woman. We want to demolish museums and libraries, fight morality, feminism, and all opportunist and utilitarian cowardice. Let the good incendiaries with charred fingers come. Here they are. Heap up the fire to the shelves of the libraries. Divert the canals to flood the cellars of the museums. Let the glorious canvases swim ashore." Imagine what this man could have done on Truth Social, huh? The futurists socialized and exhibited in Paris with the international avant-garde. At the bottom there, Gino Severini meets the Eiffel Tower, a suitably exciting futurist subject. At the top, now here's one for you. At the top, a Belgian called Jules Schmalzigog and a motorcycle bought by a Dutch collector. So there was a futurist diaspora, and not just to Russia and Belgium, but also to the United States in the person of the Italian Joseph Stella, who'd known the futurists in his home country of Italy and in Paris, who'd emigrated to New York and had celebrated it 30 years before Mondrian as the city of the future, including the electrified paradise of Coney Island at night. It's time to look back to the Netherlands in these same years. In the second lecture, I spoke briefly about De Stijl, a Dutch abstract art movement begun in the Netherlands in 1917 and disbanded 14 years later. Mondrian was the inspiration, and not just his painting at the time, but his ideas for this new approach to art, and even an approach to a new life. He called the movement neoplasticism, not very helpful, and his publication was De Stijl, not much more helpful, even for the Dutch, for whom it simply meant the style, kind of implying the new style, I think, and implying more than just painting. As to what neoplasticism meant, Mondrian had to do a lot of explaining, which he did at length and repeatedly. Here are those words on the screen next to him. In Dutch, it began as nieuwe beelding, but even beelding was unfamiliar and archaic sounding, meaning form-giving or imagining. So Mondrian translated nieuwe beelding into French as neoplasticisme. Plastic coming from shaping or molding, and translated that into English as neoplastic. But since the prefix neo denotes a revival, which it wasn't, it was all doubly misleading. But through the haze of Mondrian's words, you could make out a shape. and he was at pains to explain it. His younger partner in the project, Theo van Doesburg, pitched it to the art world in 1917 with a new magazine under the new name De Stijl. It was aimed at painters, sculptors, architects. There were eventually 100-odd members from Europe and America. In the second lecture, I read you some key parts of the manifesto of De Stijl, which appeared 3 years after the World War I had broken out. The main idea is that the old dominance of individual will and individual power must give way to a new universal awareness. Here's a bit of the text. The war is destroying the old world with its contents, individual domination in every state. The new art has brought forward what the new consciousness of time contains, a balance between the universal and the individual. It called for artists of the world to join in the war against individual despotism and to work for an internationalized unity in life, art, and culture. Mondrian follows up with his prescription for art. It's pure. It aims for the aims for the absolute. Artists will be moved by nature, the recognizable world, moved by it, but will make abstract art stripped of recognizable images and primary colors plus black and white. The artist will bring these into what he called dynamic equilibrium of opposing elements, avoiding symmetry. And if artists can achieve that and visitors absorb it, we will gradually be strengthened in mind and heart and be better citizens in a less despotic society. Well, neoplasticism made converts, even before it had a name, starting with Theo van Doesburg himself. He was adept and clever and energetic and persuasive. As a painter, he was impatient with Mondrian's limits and boundaries from the beginnings. In 1916, for instance, he was aware that Mondrian was making his most radical works yet, there on the left, using nothing but short vertical and horizontal lines to evoke the sea and the shifting movement. Doesburg adopted the device for a sort of quasi-abstract version of a woman in an office, in a chair, with a typewriter, created by the void between the sticks. Kind of bit of cleverness, borderline gimmick. Doesburg did for Mondrian, however, what Mondrian could not have done for himself, which is to get an international platform for his work and his ideas. In his own studio, he was adept at riffing on Mondrian imagery, going beyond it in many directions. The composition at the left, for example, Mondrian's empty square. In the one at the center, the superimposed grid, and at the right, the play with diagonals, which Mondrian had absolutely banished, and in fact, after debating the matter with Doesburg, sort of cut him out, broke with him. A couple of painters who joined De Stijl had a genuine originality, and they're worth a look here, I think. This is a Hungarian emigre in Holland, Vilmos Huszár, whose free compositions take more from Doesburg, I think, than from Mondrian. He designed the magazine, and like many other De Stijl artists, he ventured into product design, furniture, interiors, even sculpture. But a lot of his work hasn't survived, or it's gotten lost, like this metal automaton on the far right of a dancer that was shown in Dada exhibitions in the 1920s and has since vanished. This man, Georges van Tongerlo, was a Belgian, the only sculptor in the founding group of De Stijl, who worked to apply the fundamental ideas to three-dimensional, non-figural pieces, mostly freestanding, that had to be coherent and pleasing from various points of view as you move around them. This was the difficult but traditional challenge of figure sculpture in the round. This is a man called Chris Bakeman, who was 30 years old and an anarchist when he was attracted to de Stael, thinking that these radical artists could be useful in the struggle. He's traded his colorful, flat, at the upper left, pseudo-primitive style for Duisberg's brand of neoplasticism in the middle, and he sticks with it until his social conscience during the Depression takes hold, and in solidarity with demonstrators on the streets protesting cuts in welfare payments by the government, he turned to realism. That's not a trajectory that many Dutch artists have followed. And here's a German artist from the de Stael group who had a long career as a painter and graphic designer, Friedrich Vordenberger Gildewart. Duisberg followed de Stael heavily, promoted it heavily in Germany. He was trying to get himself on the faculty of the Bauhaus, and in 1924 he converted Vordenberger in Hanover, where a few other important artists were working abstractly, particularly Kurt Schwitters and Hans Arp. Vordenberger was a talented and pretty original painter of geometric abstraction. He had the distinction of being labeled a degenerate artist by the Nazis, moved to Switzerland, then Amsterdam, where he became a Dutch citizen. The gallery acquired two of his paintings from his nephews, the two very delicate and suggestive paintings at the left side. The reach of Mondrian's ideas was quite wide in Europe and America, well beyond the actual members of de Stael, and a lot wider than we can reach in this lecture. But here I want to turn to architecture for a moment, and design. Duisberg's magazine and his sort of missionary travels encouraged a merger of art and architecture. This merger had been an ideal of very much modernism, the total work of art, the Gesamtkunstwerk, described by Wagner, who integrated set design to poetry and music. Duisberg was an interior designer himself who applied de Stael forms and colors in his work with architects. And in the middle here is a demonstration published in de Stael in collaboration with Gerrit Rietveld. And at the right, a tile floor with his colleague in de Stael, Jacobus Oud. Given the chance to create something in a bigger scale, a kind of walk-in sculptures, immersive, as the word is today, Duisberg did a makeover of a grand 18th century building in Strasbourg to make a cafe and a movie theater and dance hall at the left here. He and Hans Arp and Sophie Teuber Arp, the two husband and wife Swiss modernists, did a huge makeover with him in de Stael colors. And it's been restored recently, and now it's open again. Mondrian paid attention to what Duisberg and the architects were doing to test immersive installations. He actually had a head start. He'd experimented with these things in his own Paris studio in the 1920s and 30s. At the left, he's still in Amsterdam with 19th century furniture, objects here and there, paintings hung up high, drawings pinned up, canvases stacked in the background. It's just the kind of live-work arrangement with a stagey flavor that was expected at the time. The pioneer modernist Mondrian lived differently. It was a skylit walk-up whose front door remains famous from a photograph taken of it by a young Hungarian visitor, André Kertész, who sets up the shot complete with a single tulip to emphasize the kind of hushed, minimalist life led by a Dutch aesthete. And the reality was actually a lot busier. The room was a lot busier, and the room in center, in fact, with lots of stuff stashed in shelves and cabinets, paintings hung high, and what everybody who went there remarked, lots of cardboard panels painted in primary colors, plus black and white, pinned to the white walls that he would move around. Mondrian's studio was so remarkable that he had it photographed in 1926, and recently the Tate in Liverpool had it reconstructed life-size on the left. The Kunstmuseum in The Hague made a model on the right, which you could look into. In October 1930, a young American sculptor living in Paris came to visit Mondrian. He wrote this: "It was a very exciting room. Light came in from the left and from the right, and on the solid wall between the windows there were experimental stunts with colored rectangles of cardboard tacked on. Even the Victrola, which had been some muddy color, was painted red. I suggested to Mondrian that perhaps it would be fun to make these rectangles oscillate, and he, with a very serious countenance, said, 'No, it is not necessary. My painting is already very fast.'" And he kept on, he went on to say, "This one visit gave me a shock that started things." By started things, Alexander Calder meant that he'd been converted to abstraction, and he'd also picked up a few colors that he was going to become known for. Collectors in Dresden had been buying Mondrian's paintings, and they knew about his studio, so Mondrian designed a room in Madame Binard's house. It would have been a kind of walk-in Mondrian. The project didn't get built, but we have a couple of drawings, an isometric projection on the left, and what they call an open box drawing on the right with all four walls splayed out. So, a whole lot of Mondrian, and just a built-in love seat and a coffee table for comfort. The architect and designer Gerrit Rietveld was a product of De Stijl and a member. His greatest surviving building is this house, built on a lot at the end of a row of 19th century houses in Utrecht. The woman who commissioned it, who was a progressive-minded single mom with 3 children, named Truus Schröder, she wanted something different, and she got it. It is the fullest realization of De Stijl principles of openness, strict geometry, thoughtful scale, ingenuity, sliding panels to change room shapes and sizes, primary colors, fluid circulation, light and air. The upstairs here at the upper right is particularly wonderful. And at the bottom, there's that invention of Rietveld's that became a kind of icon for De Stijl, a chair that he designed in 1917 and got repainted 6 years later in Mondrian colors. On the bottom of the seat of the chair, Rietveld had a poem incised that read, "When I sit, I do not want to sit as my seated flesh likes, but rather as my seated spirit would sit if it wove the chair for itself." Just one more De Stijl building project. On the right, this row of 5 houses by Jacobus Oud, who was the architect of the building with Duisburg's yellow and black tile floor you saw a moment ago. Oud had been on the De Stijl roster with Mondrian from the very beginning in 1917. And this is his contribution to the famous project of the summer of 1927 in Stuttgart. 17 invited architects, including Le Corbusier and Walter Gropius and others, to be a showcase for modern housing, which was Oud's specialty. I can't talk about this project and De Stijl architecture without first showing you another building. This is Le Corbusier's corner house, and also a nod to the competition for de Stael, which had so many ideas and principles in common. And that's the great German Academy for the Arts, whose buildings in Dessau were going up at the same time, designed by its director and founder, Walter Gropius. That's another lecture. But I do have to read you a letter from Duisburg, founder of de Stael, who went to the Bauhaus to teach and conquer. He wrote to a friend, "At the Bauhaus, I have radically overturned everything. This is a famous academy which now has the most modern teachers. I have talked to the pupils every evening, and I have infused the poison of the new spirit everywhere. De Stael will soon be published again and more radically. I have mountains of strength, and I know now that our notions will be victorious over everyone and everything." So this man has become a futurist. Anyway, a zealot. I have to descend from a moment now from the lofty subjects of Mondrian's meanings and the adaptation of his ideas in the world, just to a few crass facts about him. And Mondrian has been worth a lot of money to a lot of people, and I'm not even including the owners of his paintings. It's a game of associations and prestige. When his studio was open to visitors and photographers, just after his death in 1944, some pictures like this in fashion magazines quickly led to Mondrian's art becoming identified with sophisticated modernity. You could be chic in black, particularly if you visited abstract painters' studios and recognized Mondrian's paintings like the one on the easel. You could be comfortably stylish in unstructured sweaters, especially if you were on close terms with highly structured abstract paintings. Or, 20 years later, you could be a walking billboard. Not accidentally during the first Mondrian retrospective in 1965 and 66. The Gemeentemuseum in The Hague, the Gemeentemuseum in The Hague, which is home to the greatest collection of Mondrian's work, gave its okay to this photo shoot for Yves Saint Laurent in 1965 and used some of its slimmer docents to serve as models. Some of Saint Laurent's dresses were the irresistible choice for the cover of Nancy Troy's very fine and engrossing book of 2012 on the whole subject called The Afterlife of Piet Mondrian. It's in the bibliography on the Yale University website, gallery website. Anyway, it's Saint Laurent Mondrian-ish dresses were knocked off by lots of mass producers and spread the Mondrian brand far and wide. When we arrived in Los Angeles in 1983, there was a generic mid-50s apartment building in West Hollywood being turned into a hotel, Le Mondrian, and getting painted on the outside by an Israeli abstract artist called Yaakov Agam in boogie-woogie colors. Soon that got faded and dated, and Le Mondrian had a facelift, and looks like this now. And meanwhile, the Mondrian Hotel Company was building elsewhere, building in the Arabian Gulf, in Qatar. Times were changing. No more rectangles and primary colors for this Mondrian. It is a Mondrian in brand only. Well, if in 2017 you'd been in Doha and you'd checked out of the Mondrian Hotel and you flew to Amsterdam and you went on to The Hague for some quiet good taste, and you'd have gone by the pristine new City Hall by Richard Meyer and found this startling adaptation. And there's no getting away from Mondrian in Holland. This was temporary, though, on stick-on plastic sheets to celebrate the 100th anniversary of De Stijl. And De Stijl was virtually identical in the public mind to Mondrian. Big Mondrian exhibitions in major cities in the United States and Europe have not only produced and sponsored a lot of scholarship and excellent catalogs and books, but also a tsunami of merchandise. Whatever your cravings may be, there's a Mondrian product for you. Just a snack? There's a delicious but labor-intensive cake that you can make if you have the time. And if you have even more time, there's a jigsaw puzzle, the same one that your parents bought in the 1960s. Or if you just want to have a cigarette, it's just the thing for thinking about Mondrian, who smoked like a chimney. There's this. And you might just want to stop and browse around the gift shop. And almost any museum gift shop, there's no end to it. Finally, I want to come back to Mondrian himself for a moment and talk about the purpose of his work and what he thought he could accomplish. And how. Accomplish for us, if anything, and for art, and for human society. After years of experiments, he said that his art would express what he called pure reality. And he'd do that by reducing the forms of nature to their constant elements, not images, just horizontal and vertical lines, but no curves, rectangles, and the three primary colors, plus black and white. So why do that? Well, because he wanted to express the vastness of nature, he said, its extent, its repose, its unity. And why just its constant elements, the horizontal and vertical lines? Well, because, he said, they are the pure expression of opposing forces. The vertical and the horizontal exist everywhere and dominate everything. Their reciprocal action constitutes life. The equilibrium of any aspect of nature rests on the equivalence of its opposites. Now, Mondrian was no physicist, but he knew about molecular motion. He knew the fact that what appears fixed and solid to the eye is actually, on closer examination, in restless, teeming action, what he called dynamic movement in equilibrium. Mondrian was no biologist either, but he was convinced that art needed to evolve. He grew up at a time when the idea of evolution being a process found in culture, not just biology, and as conditions change, all the forms of art will be replaced by newer, better adapted ones. That evolution, in turn, makes society healthier, less oppressive. In writing in the age of Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin, he said, "In the present moment, oppression is so clearly evident that everyone must regard it as one of the greatest evils." But does everyone see this evil in its real significance, in its positive and negative factors? Events pass, but oppression remains as long as it is not individually and actively opposed by an equal force. To be opposed, it must be viewed realistically, observed, and studied. It must be basically understood if it's not to continue in the new forms. Destruction is followed by construction. So Mondrian's diagnosis is that we're suffering from oppression, and we can cure oppression by being free, and be free by defeating its cause, which is our ignorance of true reality. Art can express true reality if it gets rid of its ancient habit of representation and uses only the most simplified, fundamental means. No more mimicry. With the help of a new kind of art, which we look at, think about, we absorb, we can gain a deeper understanding of the world and each other. The transformation may take generations or even centuries. And now, a century later, we can vouch for that. We've even invented some new kinds of oppression. For a long time, I assumed that Mondrian was another interesting utopian between the wars, like Kandinsky and Boccioni, and just as doomed to failure. No doubt, he believed. He worked in earnest, hard and long, but could it ever have come true that an elite of thoughtful people would grasp it, perpetuate it, elect better, wiser, better balanced people to govern us, that we'd be less selfish, less tribal, less belligerent? That's what Mondrian believed. How likely was that? And what if we don't believe it? Assuming some of us don't believe in Mondrian's prescription, is he still worthwhile to us, and why? I'm going to make a couple of suggestions to close. There are many things about his life and character that I've learned to admire. Bravery is one of them. His career was full of experiments and some great leaps away from the obvious. There were some shocks. It took amazing courage to experiment for the conservative, skeptical Dutch public with this sort of squinty display of clashing colors to a venerable subject. It was an embarrassing dead end when he exhibited a triptych of semi-cubist allegorical females in an attempt to symbolize human potential for growth and enlightenment. When he wanted to recreate the sensations of awe and wonder at the endless, restless sea, he found this strange formula that had both the variety of the sea and its repetitiveness, and went beyond cubism. When he wanted to join the company of great artists who had painted starry skies, he tried to evoke the sensation of that by, of all things, creating a uniform grid that glitters. When he found solutions, he kept testing and opening new doors. Even when he admitted that he was pleased and made his clients happy, he'd go off in another direction. The last leap was at the age of 70 in a new country when he took some liberties with the rule book he'd written and lived by for 25 years or so, neoplasticism, and made paintings that recreated the structure and patterns and the energy of the city. That last leap took courage. What's made Mondrian more valuable to me was a practice of experimenting on my own with sitting, not looking at art, but looking at nothing, letting go of my habits of mental hyperactivity and analytical thinking and fear of failure over what I didn't know. Having students has helped me really observe. And information, I found, has a way of inhibiting one's capacity to respond to most works of art, especially abstract ones, and even to speculate on the associations that they may arouse. Anyway, a lot of looking in a speculative way without the pressure of Mondrian's ideas of what's good for me has led me to relax a bit with the artist. I came to see Mondrian's paintings here and everywhere as a type of exercise equipment to stretch and strengthen my powers of observation and imagination. I think they're an invitation by Mondrian to look closely, of course, and I think to speculate what is going on here. And never mind that Mondrian was pretty explicit about his paintings not representing anything outside themselves. They are what Mondrian called the abstract real. But sometimes in the paintings, associations arise that we shouldn't ignore, and I think he's given us permission, in fact, he's given us food for thought. this again. For me, there is that radiant yellow at the top, the deep blue below, the unbounded pale sky blue above. It's not a schematic day at the beach. But those colors in that configuration please me in a way that's familiar. Would Mondrian scold me for admitting that? I kind of doubt it. Remember, he's the one who told a critic it was okay if he felt that spirit of Christmas in a purely abstract black and white painting that he made. It was the feeling, in other words, that that association had for that person that mattered to Mondrian. And back to this. I think that the wide-open, diamond-shaped compositions invite you to speculate outside the picture. I think Mondrian wanted us to observe how he achieved dynamic equilibrium with those lines and a little bit of blue. Okay, fine, we can see that. We might even associate the lines with something like a dancer at the bar, related to the way that the canvas stands on point. Okay, that's the world inside the canvas. But that 45-degree tilt seems to me like the artist's arbitrary interference with the bigger picture outside. He encourages you to ask what's been cropped out. Isn't this tilted square a kind of aperture into a bigger field of completely unknowable dimensions? All we know of this imaginary field is that it has 4 shapes defined by the lines, and one of those shapes is blue. This looks to me like a demonstration of the tiny extent of our knowledge and the vastness of our ignorance. Lately, I've been studying photographs taken by the Hubble Space Telescope of endless galaxies, trillions of miles away. This has made me exhilarated and humbled, and in the end, modest, I think, and a true believer. And I love this painting more and more. But that's another lecture too. Thank you very much, all of you, for your patient attention to all this talk. Thank you.